Hello, I'm Justin Wheeler, and welcome to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. Confidence is a tricky thing. It's simple to say, to talk about, and to identify, but confidence is difficult to reach, and it's even harder to hold on to. During today's Nonstop Nonprofit, we'll talk to a fundraiser-turned-executive-coach whose confidence unlocked an almost 4x increase in her nonprofit's revenue. Once she had the key, Mallory Erickson took it a step further, passing along her hard-won knowledge to thousands of nonprofits through targeted coaching programs. My conversation with Mallory took me back to my time as a fundraiser. For context, while these days it's pretty common to follow loads of skilled specialists on social media, back then many of us learned on the job. We weren't necessarily taught the stuff that Mallory brings to the table, and it's a shame. Fundraising is so much easier when you view your nonprofit's value through a funder's lens. Speaking of value, that's the key to confidence I mentioned earlier. Hearing Mallory lay it out, you'll see that it's all connected. When the value your nonprofit offers aligns with a funder, the dynamics of your conversation are fundamentally shifted. Listen in as Mallory and I discuss assets you never knew you had, smash the power dynamics of outdated fundraiser-funder relationships, and try on a different lens to reveal your true confidence as a fundraiser. Let's dive in. It is your number one priority to ensure that your business can continue to deliver on its mission, whether it's this year, next year, and beyond.
I'm always so baffled when I do webinars. There's always somebody at the end who raises their hand and says, I'm the development director. Should I have access to the budget? I'm always like, yes, you've got to know that.
The best thing that we can do is just raise as much money as possible and then give it to the people around the world.
If you're going to be sustainable, you have to have a multi-channel strategy to reach all of these different generations of donors however they want to be reached.
The best thing you can ever do as a nonprofit leader is spend as much money as possible on your story.
And it snowballs like any peer-to-peer campaign. The more people that view this content, the further and further it grows.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
That is unacceptable, and that is not the way to run a board.
The more nonprofits can give their donor base that experience of the impact that's being made on the ground level, there's nothing else that you have to give someone. This is Nonstop Nonprofit. Mallory, thank you so much for joining Nonstop Nonprofit podcast. How are you doing today?
I am doing great, and I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks for agreeing to come on. We're super excited to have you today. Really excited to kind of dig into what it means to become a confident fundraiser. And the reason why I'm excited to have this conversation with you is because not only were you a former, nonprofit executive, fundraiser, now you're training nonprofits all across the country. And so I think you're going to have a lot of really good things to say. So thanks for coming on and having this conversation with me today.
Yeah, one of my favorite topics. So I'm excited.
Awesome. So let's jump in with your nonprofit story. I like to ask this to every guest. How did you get involved in the nonprofit space, and tell us a little bit more about your background in within nonprofits?
Yeah. So I graduated my undergraduate program from University of Michigan, really focused on sociology and political science and social change. And I thought actually when I left that I was going to go to Washington and sort of back to public policy school. I was really interested in education reform and education policy in particular. But I decided that I wanted to spend sort of a few years understanding the intersection between the public school system, the nonprofit sector, and policy. So I went and did a fellowship program through an organization called Citizen Schools in Boston, where I got my master's in education, and I was in the middle school environment in an extended learning day program. And I had gone because they also had kind of a policy and advocacy arm. And so I thought it would be this really interesting opportunity to sort of see how it all came together. But I ended up falling in love with the nonprofit and with the school. And so I actually never even did kind of that part of the program, and instead stayed sort of on the ground running the organization in the school partnership model, which then led me to other, education nonprofits. And I think, I really believed and believe that the nonprofit sector is a place to catalyze tremendous change. And I think once I was in and didn't really have, consider another path for me. And so went on to work in a number of other education organizations, grew and an international exchange organization that worked on the ground actually year round in the US, Nicaragua, and Ecuador, and then went on to run an organization focused on education, but tailored to people with diabetes. So that was like my first sort of introduction into the healthcare space, but with a strong education component. Yeah, so there's just been the education thread has really been a huge part of my journey. And then, obviously now get to work with hundreds of organizations every year and support amazing work across the world.
Wow. So you've done a few things, it sounds like, in the nonprofit sector. One sort of thing that, looking kind of at your track record of growing nonprofits, one in particular, you took from $1 million to 3.6, nearly 4xing sort of the organization. So talk to us a little bit about how you achieved such tremendous growth in a short period of time. What were the strategies and how did you get to that growth story?
Yeah. So, I think with all of my fundraising experience, it's been really trying to look carefully at what works and what are the particular, I call them now inside my program assets, but I didn't always have that language. But it was what were the things that the organization had that were aligned with particular types of funders? And then I've just kind of doubled down and tripled down there. I think one of the things that gets us really distracted in the nonprofit sector, and I'm not at all saying we don't need diversified funding. Of course we do. But I think when we think about diversified funding, we're oh, we need it, this much in foundations and this much in individuals. But this organization, they had tremendous value to companies, And they weren't positioned very well, frankly, for a foundation based on the programs that they were offering. And so instead of banging my head against the wall trying to find foundation fits, I really grew the corporate partnership program so that instead of 5 companies funding this organization, it was 46 when I left.
Wow.
And so I think just really recognizing the strength of the organization, creating partnership opportunities that mattered, that were going to move the needle on the issue that the organization cared about, that these partners cared about, and really finding successful strategic partnerships was kind of the name of the game.
Wow, that's amazing. And you said something I'd like to underscore. I think is a super important point. You talked about diversity in funding. And I think where a lot of people get this wrong is, they assume diversifying funding is diversifying channels. And not every nonprofit belongs, in every single fundraising channel, obviously. I think, what you mentioned going from 5 to 46 funder or corporations, that's a tremendous story of success in diversified funding, right? It's when I think about it and when I talk about when I talk to nonprofits about this, it's more of how do we get 20% of your donors not funding 80% of your budget, right? That's really what we want to try to achieve here. So I appreciate that point and totally agree that diversity in funding isn't always channel specific, could just be, doubling down on something that's working really well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I could not agree more.
So what's interesting in your story is, you're very successful, but you share that you hated almost everything day to day, specifically as it related to fundraising. And so curious, because typically when someone finds a lot of success in something, they typically enjoy it. And it sounded like, it was kind of the grind for you. And so would love if you could just unpack a little bit what you mean by you kind of lost the enthusiasm or whatever it might have been. And so would love to kind of unpack that story a bit.
Yeah. So, what I'll say is that a lot of the success that I saw in that last story I shared started to happen when my experience with fundraising started to change. So that organization moved from $1 million to 1.6. Yeah. When I still really hated fundraising. And then the sort of explosion happened when I started to have a lot more fun and I started to recognize what I said before around sort of where is there alignment to build really mutually beneficial partnerships? And, I think the reason that for so many years I hated fundraising, and yeah, I still saw success in my past organizations because, the name of the game there was hustle, and I can do that if I need to, but I don't want nonprofit leaders to operate that way, right? And so what I did, or the reason that I disliked it so much is that I just found fundraising and sort of the way we've all been taught to fundraise to be this super uncomfortable practice. I would go to these fundraising trainings where they would talk about the 12 to 18 month like major donor kind of like moves management system. And they would, tell us to go on these listening tours and never to bring up money, but to be asking them about all these things. And then you're definitely being held accountable for the money that you're getting from this person that you're not allowed to talk about money with. And I was just kind of like, what is this game? And like, I don't get it. And I just really couldn't find a way to make it feel good to me. Like I tried to follow the steps and I tried to do the things, and I just always kept walking away feeling like this is not me. And I just don't want to, and then I finally had a fundraising coach really who didn't play those same games and was sort of like, okay, Mallory, like, coaching me around. He used to have this mantra that I loved where he would say, make the ask over soup, right? And that was sort of like, don't bury the lead, like be more transparent with your funders. And what I found when he was coaching me around that was like, I didn't want to make the ask over soup. And so what happened is I started to ask myself, like, why? Like, what's coming up for me? Why am I so uncomfortable? Why don't I want to say those things? And I had this really lucky experience that when I was working with him, when I was fundraising all of this money, I went through executive coach certification, which really helped me start to understand the way my thoughts and beliefs were impacting my experience as a fundraiser. And so I really got to unpack like, oh, I don't want to make the ask over soup because I'm worried they'll be mad at me, or I worry it'll ruin the whole rest of the lunch, or I worry that they won't give it all because they'll think I was too forward, or, like I just texted a bunch of friends about trying to raise this money to house this woman fleeing domestic violence. I don't normally do this, but I'm trying to get her in a home fast. And I still had that ping of like, oh, what if they're mad that I group texted this thing, right? I think like those feelings are really natural. But I think I felt like there was no container or no space for me to talk about them.
Wow. So yeah, that's super interesting. It takes me back kind of to my fundraising days, and it's not quite as thought out as kind of what you walked through, but sort of like the golden rule that I set for myself as a fundraiser when asking for money, it was more around sort of, so when is the timing right? And so there's all sorts of like theories out there of like when you should ask somebody for money, should they know that you're going to ask them, and so forth. But sort of like what I use as an indicator when someone was getting ready was when they started inviting me to things that had nothing to do with the organization, right? So we were building a true friendship. And that's really how I tried to build all of my fundraising relationships with people, is like, I want this person to invite me to their friends get together, to their, kid's birthday, whatever it might be. And so how do I build that relationship in that way? And once those things start happening, there's that more sort of like trust. And it was, I enjoyed it because I'm an extrovert. And so I love to get to know people and love hanging out with people and so forth. And so that was one of my drivers. But all that to say, it sounds like sort of this process that you were going through internally and seeking coaching for and so forth has led you to your current business, where you're providing an array of different services. And so would love if you could kind of talk through some of the particulars about your consulting business, and would love to really shine a light on specifically something that sounds super interesting, is the Power Partners formula. You and I discussed this previously before. And so, yeah, would just love to take a few minutes to learn a little bit more about your consulting business and how you help organizations in their fundraising and executive efforts.
Yeah. So I love that. And I love what you shared, but I will do that. I will answer your actual
But
question.
I'm going to say something else.
No, I just want to say I really appreciate what you shared about your experience. And I think it highlights a really important point, which is that it's not problematic to build relationships that aren't talking about money, right? And it's not problematic to build genuine relationships. What's problematic is the disconnect between what you say you're doing and what you're trying to do. And it sounds to me like you really were trying to build these relationships. You cared about these people. You wanted to get to know them better. And that was able to be authentic for you. I think where fundraisers have the problem is when they're going to these meetings, but they aren't really tapping into that empathy, or they don't really care. And they're sort of going back to send an email to their boss about how much they raised.
Yeah, totally get that and agree with that. That sort of approach is much more transactional. It's I've got a target, I got to hit this number, whether or not my donor or donors are ready, to be asked. I have the bottom line pressure to hit these goals. My job's on the line and so forth. So yeah, totally get that.
Yeah.
Like when that pressure's there, you lose a lot of the authenticity
Yeah.
in the actual, raising or building the relationship and raising the funds.
Yeah, and so Power Partners is really based on this like fundamental concept. So I'll start with Power Partners because that's really my signature program, and all the ways that I work with organizations really center around that. So the Power Partners formula is a course that anyone can join and be a part of. It's a community of fundraising professionals, sometimes the executive director, sometimes the development director, sometimes the development coordinator, who is looking to fundamentally change the way they fundraise to focus on building reliable, sustainable, strategic partnerships with individuals, with corporations, with foundations. But the underlying principle is that we as humans, and humans being companies, and humans being foundations, and humans being individuals giving, so many of us want to achieve the same goals. We want to see the same change in our community. We want to see the same change in our world. And not everyone, but your job as a fundraiser is to identify the people who do, who share the desire to impact the world the way that your organization impacts the world. And your job is to be able to find them and identify them, and then to speak to them in that shared language. So really to understand, I talk about a lot inside my program, this idea of funder lenses. How do you put on the glass? I'm wearing pink glasses, you're wearing green glasses, and so when I'm talking to you, I need to sometimes think about, what does this look like through green glasses? Because if I describe something to you and it's all pink, you're going to be like, I have literally no idea what she's talking about, right? But if I know you're wearing green glasses and I describe something to you through the lens of green glasses, you're going to be able to connect with what it is that I'm sharing with you. And it doesn't mean you're sharing something fundamentally differently. Like, these principles sort of go back to design thinking concepts around empathy, right? Like, we all experience the world in different ways. And it's our job as fundraisers to find the people where that alignment is really there, and then be able to translate that alignment to the lenses that different funders are wearing. And we need to do that in the way we engage them. We need to do that in the way we have conversations with them. And then being authentic and transparent around our desire to build mutually beneficial partnerships. Like, I see you. Like, I see what you're trying to do out there. It's so clear to me based on X and Y that you really want to move the needle around Z. Over here at our organization, we are fiercely committed to the same thing. I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to come together and be able to blank, blank, blank. Like, that is so different than like, hey, come to our gala because we're like in your local community, and buy a table for your friends because you should.
Right.
Right. And so that Power Partners is really based on, like, my mantra for Power Partners is that great fundraising is not an ask, it's an offer. And when we understand that, and when we internalize that, and I have a process inside the course called asset mapping, where organizations lay out all of the things of value inside their organization, way beyond their programs and services, but things like thought leaders on their board of directors, or the skills of their different staff members, the number of people on their email list, their Instagram following, their blogs that could be sponsored by companies where there's content overlap, audience sharing. I mean, they have so much. And actually, I just got off, I can't say too much about this yet, but I got off a call with someone today who works with some of the biggest brands in the world around and helping them become like businesses for good, like really. And the thing he said, nonprofits do not recognize that they are sitting on treasure, that they have the keys that so many people are looking for around what's happening in communities, how to move the needle on certain things. But there's a communication gap with their ability to connect with either sometimes it's the for-profit sector, sometimes it's the individuals with their different life experiences, and sometimes, it's foundations, because again, they're writing everything from their pink glasses.
Right.
And so Power Partners is really like helping them both be able to put on those other glasses, identify the assets of the organization, match them appropriately, so find that alignment, and then get over that communication gap by effectively engaging them.
Yeah,
That was a lot.
was this? No, it was good. It was. I mean, lots of things to unpack there. Is this sort of specific program? Is it in a way? Is it kind of your own journey to kind of rediscovering what it meant to be a fundraiser? Is that kind of how you curated this program to help others? Because it seems the passion for fundraising is stronger than it has ever been, and you've got all these tactics. Could sound negative, but it's really meant to be positive. You have these strategies to really help individuals, organizations accelerate their own sort of fundraising. And so, what was like the light bulb moment for you that went off that kind of reignited this part of your professional sort of career around fundraising and within nonprofits? Because it sounds like a lot of sort of this is based on your own experience and your own journey as a fundraiser.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think I'm going to share something I've never actually shared before. But so first I started just coaching, using my executive coaching skills with nonprofits one-on-one. And my one-on-one practice filled up really fast. And so I was like, okay, I need a way to support organizations where they don't have to hire me one-on-one. So I knew I needed to create a course. And for months, I had this feeling like when you have a word on the tip of your tongue, that kind of like feeling like something's in your head, but it's like not all connecting. Like the course was in there. And I cannot remember the light bulb moment, but something happened and it just like exploded out of me. I mean, I wrote the entire course in 3 days, and it was just like there. And yes, I think a lot of it is my personal experience. A lot of it is the experience of my clients and all the organizations I was seeing as I was coaching. And I think so much of what is inside the course and what's inside my practice is like, okay, looking at what are the things that we're not taking action on, but we have the tools around. So like when I started to really look at, okay, there's plenty of template emails out there that people aren't using or aren't sending. Why? That question about like, why didn't I want to make the ask first at the beginning of the meeting? Why don't people want to be more transparent in their emails? Why? So I really started to like unpack the barriers that were coming up for people. And using executive coaching framework, I've been trained in habit building and behavior change with BJ Fogg. I've done work with IDEO on design thinking. And so having these different frameworks to start to kind of decode, like, what are the barriers? Like we have so many things that we need. I mean, I remember saying to you when we first talked, like, gosh, I watch organizations with tech solutions that could solve 80% of their problems, but they're using 20% of the software. And why? Like, why? And I know what they'll say at first is that they don't have time, but
Right.
that isn't really it. There's something else there. And so much of it was like, yes, uncovering it in my own personal journey when I started to ask myself those questions, and then also asking dozens of fundraisers what was getting in their way from taking a certain action and really being able to identify some like patterns in what was holding them back. And so Power Partners combines the technical, like with asset mapping. I was like, okay, great fundraising is not an ask, it's an offer. That I did this fearless fundraising webinar throughout 2020. I kept saying that, but I was watching that folks weren't able to like internalize that. They were like, that sounds cool. And like, I'm going to give you a like on Instagram, but like, did they really feel that the way I feel it? They didn't. And I was like, okay, so what's the process to get them to recognize that they have something incredible to offer? And asset mapping was the solution to that, because when they map all their assets, they see what they have to offer. And so not only are they able to leverage those in conversations with funders, but they show up to those conversations feeling so different.
Right. And your motto of like, it's not an ask, it's an offer, becomes a lot more grounded in that asset mapping exercise, right?
Yes.
It's aside from like the tax write-off and the donor feeling, good about themselves, which is, definitely something to be, something to be said for sure. But it's also like, look at all this other value that we offer.
Exactly.
Another one, I actually just was talking to someone today, and I actually think the employer brand is another sort of asset that can be leveraged. I think Charity Water does this best, where they make donors feel almost like they have FOMO, but or
Mhm.
into people who are thinking about giving, it's almost like you have FOMO for not giving to charity water because you want to be a part of that club, right? And so that's
Mhm.
another sort of, I guess, way to leverage an asset of an organization.
Mm.
But something you also said, and something I've seen kind of just through what I've read up about these different programs and services that you offer, is it seems like you're also playing a pretty big role in helping instill confidence into fundraisers. And I think this is like one of the larger problems in our industry today is a lot of fundraisers, didn't go to school to be fundraisers. Maybe it's like their second or third career, path. And so there's just a lack of confidence, whether it's asking for money or just creating a strategic plan on how to fund the organization. And so talk to us about how you help people become more confident in what they're doing. Are there any like secrets to becoming a more confident fundraiser, or is it more of a muscle that you just
Mm.
condition, over and over again? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's both. So I think, one of the sort of underlying executive coaching tools I use is something called the cognitive behavior loop, which is the idea that our beliefs and our thoughts inform how we feel and then
Hmm.
ultimately how we show up. And how we show up, of course, impacts our results. So whenever we're having trouble with our results, I want to go back to like, what is the thought and what is the belief, right? And sometimes you need to start with the feeling, right? Okay, so how do you feel about fundraising, right? If you have that like gut dropping feeling in your belly when you're going into donor meetings, what are the thoughts or what are the beliefs that are leading you to that feeling, right? Because fundraising is not inherently stressful. And like before people hang up the podcast, just hear me out for a second because fundraising is just fundraising, right? What's stressful are the thoughts and the beliefs we have about fundraising. They didn't give last year, so they won't give again this year. Some of the things I said before, this person might be mad at me for sending blank. What if my friends never invite me to parties anymore because I'm always talking about my nonprofit? Oh, I sent the thing I hear from board members the most. I emailed my friends last year, right? Like, why do I have to email them again this year? And I always say to board members when they say that, I go, hey, do you ever get mad like when somebody invites you to a birthday party again, like the next year, and you're like, hey, I went and brought a gift last year? It's like, of course not, right? But we have these like perceptions and beliefs that are deeply rooted to money, value, being helpful, these things that we really identify with that are core to who we are, that get triggered when fundraising comes up. And so for me, confidence comes from like, first of all, unwinding that story and understanding that story. Like, I am really like against like kind of toxic positivity, and I always say like mindset even now is getting a little bit like corrupted as a word, because it's like people think mindset is like a mantra on your mug, and I'm like, no, like real mindset work involves understanding what is happening in your brain and recognizing that you have tremendous power to change it. So, like, the first step in building confidence, I think, is acknowledging even the thoughts and beliefs that you're holding, and then recognizing that you have the opportunity to choose different thoughts and beliefs. And when you do, confidence, yes, it's a practice because, like I said, I still got triggered a little bit when I sent that text to all my friends. That's very normal, right?
Mm.
But like that feeling would never paralyze me anymore. It would have paralyzed me 5 years ago. I probably wouldn't have even sent the text message, right? And so
Mm.
that's where the practice piece comes in, of like really recognizing that, yeah, look, we have been taught money stories, and particularly for women, we have been taught money stories about whether or not we're even allowed to talk about money for our whole lives. And so, of course, it's going to be uncomfortable to break out of some of those things. But I think when we know that it's like, okay, like, yeah, you know what? I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now because biologically, as women, we are community builders. And so we never want to rock the boat. And we're always around building community. And I'm afraid that this thing is going to rock the boat in my community. And that's why I'm getting triggered. Okay, I'm used to that feeling coming up. But like, is this really threatening my community or like my friends? Nope. Okay, great. I'm going to keep going forward with that action, right? So it's really about, I think that is And confidence doesn't always have to look the same. And so I think it's this practice of just maybe even being a little bit less scared and then a little bit less scared. I say to my clients, like, you don't need to be fearless all the time. You need to have moments of fearlessness.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for confidence too. Like, just start small, like send that text message and then celebrate yourself for sending that text message. Click send on that email and then celebrate yourself for sending that email, right? All of those wins, that's what builds confidence over time.
That's why I like your lens framework, looking through like the different color lenses framework you talked about earlier, because I think, like whether it's like a fundraising ask or even like a sales, process, like there is always going to be nerve, in that, like, am I going to win this deal? Like, but I think at the end of the day, like where it all comes together is, are we a good fit, right? Is our software solution a good fit for organization A, B, or C? Is the impact that we're trying to achieve as an organization a good fit for this donor? And if you know the answer to that question, right, like you know that you are in your words giving them an offer that is something that they can't buy anywhere else, right? And so I totally agree too. Like that your point around like confidence doesn't mean like it doesn't mean you always have to like you're always not afraid to ask for money, right? Because that's I think inherently it's a touchy subject. And we talked about this a little bit, and you were kind of hinting at this, I feel like in this response. We talked about sort of the power dynamic between fundraisers and donors. And specifically, we talked about it's even more prevalent when the fundraiser is a woman. And so I was wondering, can you unpack that? Like, and what, like, how can we overcome this? Because I feel like, especially the nonprofit community, this power dynamic shouldn't exist. And so what are ways that we as a community, as a culture, can help overcome this power dynamic between fundraisers and funders?
God, this is a huge question.
I could spend a whole podcast on this.
Yeah. I think first, even just giving platform, like even just bringing up that question is a really important first step. I think for us all to be talking about this, like one of my biggest regrets running organizations is that I didn't talk about this with my staff like this, and especially young fundraisers coming into my organization. I started fundraising when I was 23 years old, particularly from older men wanting money. And, it's like, I think people can imagine and feeling like I had nothing to offer in exchange for that money. So that inherently sets up like, I think we're taught so often, or like just by being in the country we live in, here in the US, and I know we're not alone in this, that we feel like money is the only thing with value, right? It's like how we measure so much of value. And so I think recognizing that like inside organizations, your fundraiser not closing a gift because there was a really like uncomfortable power dynamic that they needed to be excused from in that moment, and treating them with the love and compassion and space to process that. Like that's really important. Like I think this is a big shift for us to make as a sector, to acknowledge these power dynamics and to recognize that if we just keep moving forward with them, we're actually working in direct conflict with the problems in our world we're trying to solve. And I think giving space for that conversation and for women to talk about uncomfortable experiences. I will say that I did not think I could even say that, or that I could even process it, or, that it wouldn't sort of get flipped on me as me just being a bad fundraiser, when I'm like, oh man, that felt super uncomfortable. And like, who can I even talk to about that? Right. And so it's weird. We have this thing that's related to performance and money. And when we don't feel like we have anything of value that's being exchanged for that money, it sets up this power dynamic, right? And so I think both for fundraisers, like that's sort of the thing behind asset mapping for me, is like, I didn't want people showing up to tables with donors anymore feeling like they did not have a lot of value that they were giving, because I knew that would, one, allow them to like sit in themselves in a much more confident way, but it would also shift that dynamic, because when they show up more confidently, that starts to shift the dynamic. I would send emails to funders that say, the fourth email to a funder about something to say, hey, I'm about to close this round on corporate sponsorship. I definitely don't want to hound you, but I don't want you to miss this opportunity. If you're not interested, no problem. I just don't want to leave you out. Like, think about the difference in that power dynamic versus like, please, 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 right? It's like, hey, I have this thing and I want to invite you to be a part of it. And if you don't want to be there, no problem. But I don't want to make the decision for you. So I just want to give you one more shot. It's like, that's a totally different type of relationship where the power is shifting naturally because you know that you have something of value and that money is not the only thing of value in the conversation. And I think back to actually what you said before that I really appreciate is like, this is all about alignment. Like if a funder is not aligned with you and you've been transparent and authentic about who you are as an organization, like release them. Like I have had donors all the time be like, this isn't in line with my giving priorities. And sure, I'll ask some other questions about like, do you see this moving into your priority areas in the next 3 years? Or, is there anything we could do that would engage you on a deeper level? Sure. But at a certain point, I will say, do you need any help identifying another organization that you do feel strong alignment with? Because I would love to connect you with blank. And I think like if we have more of that mentality that it's not like, oh man, they rejected me, right? Because again, rejection is about the other person having the power. But instead, if it's like, yeah, this wasn't a fit, I really hope you find an organization you're a good fit for. That's like another way to just start to like disassemble that power dynamic.
Absolutely. And to that point around sort of alignment, just to kind of underscore that even more, I remember one of the first times in my fundraising career when I told a donor, hey, this is just not going to be a good fit. Like, specifically based on sort of, there's a couple things at play, but like the most important was I knew that we wouldn't be able to do what the donor wanted, right? And it just wasn't an area of expertise or focus. It was something we were interested in as an organization, but we just didn't have the infrastructure set up to deliver just yet. And this wasn't like a proof of concept donor either. It was a donor who expected, pretty immediate sort of results. And so we acknowledged that. I remember the feeling, I was like, man, that felt as good as accepting a donation. Like that sort of feeling of when you're aware enough to see that this isn't going to be a good fit. This is probably going to cause problems later, down the road. It's going to bleed in and take up more time and resources. And so I think though, the thing that fundraisers need to be able to be confident in doing that is the support from their executive director, their CEO, because too often, they're measured by, and it's not necessarily a bad way to measure a fundraiser is how much they can raise, year over year. It shouldn't be the only thing, but at the same time, you can't accept every donation. You can't chase every dollar, that comes across. And tying that back to, your point on the power dynamics of like feeling desperate versus, saying, hey, I don't want you to miss out. Like that's a super interesting concept. Gosh, I can't believe it's already been almost 40 minutes. I could talk to you forever. I could listen to you share your stories. And here we are almost 40 minutes in. So my last question here is for someone who, I think, and there's a lot of our listeners are, I would say like mid-size, small to mid-size nonprofits, single kind of fundraising team, like one person fundraising teams, 1 to 2, whatever it might be. And maybe it's their first time in a fundraising gig. What are some areas that you would recommend? Of course, they should sign up for your class, your course, and go through that program. Definitely. Anything else that you can recommend out of the gate that would just be helpful to help build their confidence, to help build their sort of capacity as fundraisers? Any direction you'd point them in as they begin in this exciting journey of raising money for changing the world?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is, so I have a free class that goes over the Power Partners Blueprint that is just at malloryerickson.com/free. And I talk there actually a lot about confidence and like confident fundraising kind of versus like the car salesman fundraising that maybe we've been taught a lot. So that's helpful. And then, I think find your people and also stop following things that aren't your people. So I would say like a lot of people follow consultants and coaches in the fundraising space on Instagram and on Facebook. And the thing I would really encourage fundraisers to do is stop following folks, and this goes for myself included, that don't make you feel empowered. Like different types of messaging and different types of communications resonate with different people. And I always say, like, I want you to find the coach and consultant for you. right? Because we regulate our nervous systems differently with different people. And so there's always going to be a coach that's more, or a consultant that's more kind of your style. And so follow them and look at what they're offering and what they're teaching and what their resources are. And then if there are folks that you're following, or you're in Facebook groups, free Facebook groups that, don't resonate with you, ditch them. Because I think one of the things that happens actually, as opposed to maybe being able to find good advice, is that people just get too much bad advice, right? That they're in all these spaces where they're just getting inundated with different fundraising ideas, with everything under the sun, right? This little thing here, this little thing here. And my recommendation is focus. Identify where the strengths are in your organization, focus, increase your skill set there, really do the thing, the thing and do it well. And like I say a lot in my course, don't build half-built bridges, right? And so I think there, if you want to be surrounded by people in your local community because you look for a local nonprofit resource center, right? If you love learning online virtually, I, like you guys, right, offer tons of resources for folks to find, through your people. So find resources through your people. They're going to recommend either their own things or people who are similar to them or resonate with them. And I feel like that's a place to start, as opposed to sort of getting scattered.
I think that's brilliant advice, and something I'd piggyback on to add to that. I think, and I totally agree. I think there's just so much noise, right? Especially on social, especially on LinkedIn today, and so I think I heard this piece of advice, which is kind of funny because I'm going to tell you the opposite, but I heard this once. I was like, yeah, that's actually so true. It's we as humans listen to people, other people's advice, way too much, right? And whereas what worked for me when I was a fundraiser, and the relationships that I was building, the organization I was at, the dynamic, the culture that was created, what worked for me may not at all work for you. And so don't take anyone's word as sort of the truth. Definitely decipher it and understand, does this resonate? Does this make sense with our audience, and so forth? I think we fundraisers can listen to other people too much and not experiment on their own. I think experimentation is so important, trying things that just kind of sometimes you can't validate with data, but you're I have a gut instinct that this is going to actually work out. I think there needs to be more of that risk taking in fundraisers. And, because I mean, that's so much of a lot of how I kind of created my path in fundraising was that. I mean, there wasn't as much content available, free content online, 10, 15 years ago. And so that's something I've also noticed is just as fundraisers, we need to take charge. We need to innovate. We need to take risks. Yes. We need to learn from other people, but don't be afraid to also discover your own path, your own way. I think there's a freedom in that.
It's so true. And I'm so glad you said it, because I think what I was trying to get at is listen to yourself in terms of what's resonating with you and what's not. And you just took it a step further, which I totally agree with. I talk a lot about how things shifted for me in so many areas of my life. First, as when I was getting yoga teacher certified, when I stopped asking, is this the right way? And started asking, how does this feel? And so that's an underlying mantra for me too. And so I love that you're asking that. You should be constantly in reflection around, how does this feel? And trying things out and iterating and getting out there and really coming back to what is happening inside you when you're taking that action.
Absolutely. Well, Mallory, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing just your wisdom and your experience with our listeners. We truly appreciate it. We're going to put links into the show notes here, how people can get access to your free course and sign up for the Power Partners Formula course as well, along with all the other services that you provide. So those will also, for the listeners, those will be in the show notes at the end of the podcast. Mallory, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. This podcast is brought to you by your friends at Funraise, nonprofit fundraising software built by nonprofit people. If you'd like to continue the conversation, find me on LinkedIn or text me at 562-242-8160. And don't forget to get your next episode the second it hits the internets. go to nonstopnonprofitpodcast.com and sign up for email notifications today. See you next time.